Hey, friends, welcome to The Right Side Up with Danielle Strickland and James Scholl, usually. This season is an eclectic mix of fascinating topics with incredible people that I've had the privilege to meet and to talk through, most of them to read their books, to be amazed by some of the things that are happening. I'm calling this the wild card season. Wild card, because you never know from episode to episode what you're going to get and what we're going to talk about, but it's going to be fun. I promise you that. You know, I spent a whole lifetime being told to either slow down or to stick to one thing. But I have always been an eclectic, wild, curious, wide-ranged person. And I love it. I love it. And I think God likes it too. And I hope you enjoy these eclectic conversations with amazing people about some really important topics. It's a wide range. It's a wild card. Get ready to enjoy. Welcome. Micah Bournes is in the house. And yeah, it's been a while. It's been a minute.
Right? It's like everything plus 4 years because of the pandemic.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I feel like,
Yeah.
but look, I'm sitting here and I feel like it's wrong for me not to show you.
Hey, nice.
Hey, so
Yeah,
I think about you
represent.
often. Literally, like every time I sit down in my living room, I'm like, Michael Bournes, fight evil with poetry. Which, if people don't
Absolutely.
know, Michael Bournes, so you are an artist, you're a poet, you're a rapper, singer, you're a speaker. Is there anything you don't do?
Dance.
You don't dance. I'm
Yeah.
shocked.
I
I'm
will make the
shocked.
music to inspire others to dance, but I only dance in the privacy of my home.
Okay. But this creative, obviously you have this creative gift of creativity. And with it, I feel like for me, part of what I've loved about just knowing you and then even listening and watching and learning from you is that your creative gift has led you to really a beautiful curiosity that
Mhm.
is that leads me to a more just and equitable world.
Mhm.
So you create this like ability to ask questions in beautiful ways, like in beautiful creative ways that make me go, oh yeah, we should probably talk about that. Or
Yeah.
I should at least probably look further into that. um and then your latest venture right now is an album called Detox. Can you tell me a little bit about how your creative gift has led you to this place, and then what you're hoping happens here?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I've always been a curious person, uh, but I had limitations that I didn't even know, right? I grew up in Southern California in Long Beach. It was very diverse. And so in my head, I was like, I'm open-minded, And but then I ended up going to college in Chicago, and even just from going from Southern California to the Midwest was a huge culture shock. And people dressed different, people thought different, even language that was the same meant different things. Conservative for California is different from conservative in the Midwest, right? And so I I was just very, very confused, I guess. But during my college years is when I started engaging creativity. I started with songwriting and then got into poetry. And one thing I noticed was conversations that were often difficult or even impossible to have in real life. If I was going to say, hey, let's sit down and let's talk about race, let's sit down and let's talk about, white supremacy or, gender or what, or queerness or whatever the thing is, a lot of people have a lot of strong feelings about all of that. But I was in these creative spaces and there were open mics and you just go and everybody listened. And it wasn't about agreeing or disagreeing, it was about sharing your art and your perspective and your story. And I just found it so fascinating that there were people who I know would never want to sit down and have a conversation with me about blackness, or they have very different opinions on it. And yet they would hear a poem of mine and they would be like, man, that hit me. That made me feel things. That made me, and so I just realized that creative expression was a way to have intimate and important conversations in ways that people they kind of let their defenses down and engage. And for myself as well, there were so many assumptions I had about certain type of people, but then when I would hear their song or hear their poem, it was like, oh, let me investigate this a little more. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Mike, I was just in London, UK, and a friend of mine went to a poetry night at the Royal Albert Hall.
Hmm.
And it was organized. I think there were like 8 poets, and they each did sort of a set. She said it was so phenomenal, but like just to be part of this art unfolding, in a season, I think, where it is very difficult to speak in a
Hmm.
way that isn't like agenda filled, but isn't
Hmm.
offering, but is true. And she said what really struck her, and there were people from different faith backgrounds and different, ethnic backgrounds and racial background. Like it was just this beautiful, diverse, unified offering of let's just give our art. Let's just be creative together. But she
Yeah.
said in almost every artist featured their faith,
Yeah.
their
Yes.
spirituality and their faith was because, of course, when you're asking those deep, deep questions, when you're going past the surface and into these like feeling based, deep existential sort of ideas of what it means to be human, that's often where faith emerges, right? Or at least where faith is found. And so she said
Yes.
she found as a Christian person who it's almost impossible to raise faith in any place without
Yes.
it being awkward and weird, which you're saying the same thing of justice issues, of social issues. They're just it's basically like a shut down season for that because of all kinds of maybe reasons. But that in that environment of poetry and offering your own experience and your own truth and your own perspective, it's a completely different um it's a completely different experience. And nobody's like, I can't believe he brought up faith, I can't believe this isn't a Christian event or whatever. And yeah, she said it was really beautiful. So even as you're saying that, I'm reminded of that conversation of just like this is a different kind of truth on offer, I think.
Yes. And you know, it was very confronting because I was raised in pretty conservative Christian spaces, and the idea is, the world hates you because you love Jesus, right? And then you get in those spaces, you're like, the world hates you because you're an arrogant jerk. Like actually, these folks have no problem with people believing in God or spirituality, or you know what I'm saying? It's but go up there with some humility. You can be convinced of what you believe without, Bible thumping and being arrogant, right? And
Mhm.
yeah, it was welcoming of all sort of faith backgrounds and ideas. And I remember just even some of my assumptions. One time I was at this open mic, and because of the neighborhood, there was a lot of immigrants and a lot of Muslim people. And I had my own assumptions. I was like very early in my 20s, and there were Muslim women in like full hijab doing spoken word poems about boys they had crushes on. And I just remember thinking like, what? And then I was like, why am I surprised that they have crutches on boys? Like what? Like, but in my head, it's like they're not allowed. Like Christianity doesn't have its own history of oppression and sexism against women and things like this and controlling women. But it was just so funny because it was like, oh, some of them were up there talking about their faith, but some of them were just talking about life and things that were relatable. And it just, yeah, it was really, really interesting to see like, actually, I've gotten more pushback in Christian spaces for some of the things I've said than in these non-religious spaces where the common denominator is creativity, right? And I think that's part of what helps too. It's like there is no expectation of us agreeing on everything. We are coming here to have an exchange and have an experience. And I just think it makes it easier for people to just appreciate what we connect on and even be challenged in a way that doesn't feel so hostile, you know?
Mhm.
So it's really beautiful. But yeah, and art in general, like yes, there are still truths being communicated in art, but it doesn't work the same way as apologetics or, a debate where it's like I'm making my case and you can choose to agree with my points and I can win this debate. Or you can choose to not agree. I wasn't convincing enough. That's not how art is. When you see a painting, when you listen to a song, you don't go, I disagree. It's like it doesn't ask, a piece of art doesn't ask you to agree or disagree. You just experience it. You see a painting and you feel whatever you feel and you think whatever you think, and you have to wrestle with that reaction. But it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. When I tell you a poem, when I share a poem about my relationship with spirituality or God, you don't have to agree or disagree. It's
Yeah.
just my experience.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. I had a friend who was a preacher and then he became a poet. And
Hmm.
he talked to me a lot about, you would know him. He's from Australia, red hair,
Oh, Joel.
uh,
Yeah, yeah,
Joel.
yeah. Yeah,
Joel.
yeah.
And I remember Joel saying to me, like, when I was a preacher, I always felt like I was like punching people in the face with
Hmm.
truth. Like my job was just to like boom people with truth. And then he said, whenever I did poetry, it was like I was open handed offering something and people could take it or not take it. And
Yes.
he said, the difference in how I felt, the difference in what happened in the room, the difference in where I can go with this is so extreme that he's like, I don't want to preach anymore.
Hmm.
All I want to do is offer what is happening in me. All I want to do is and help other people to get to a place where they're able to identify what's happening in them and then offer it as well. So he just basically was like, I don't preach anymore. And as a communicator, it was such a challenge for me. And ever since, I've never been able to lose that image whenever even I'm speaking of like, am I trying to punch people in the face here or am I trying to offer something here?
Yeah.
Um, and it's a different form, but I think there is a posture shift that is possible no matter what form your creativity takes. In that
Absolutely.
you don't have to be arrogant and punchy. You don't
Yeah.
have to be like, I'm gonna hit you in the head. You can offer something beautiful. And then I think there's something really respectful and dignified and kind of also risky in this, like, take it or leave it. It's
Yeah.
okay. Like you don't have, this doesn't have to resonate with you. You don't have to like this. You don't have to agree with this, but it's on offer here.
Yeah. And I think also there is this aspect of, with Christianity, we talk about the Great Commission, but so often it's really the other direction where we're expecting people to come to church, to come to our Christian event and to listen to us preach at them. And the thing that I like about, you know, being an artist is I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like there are folks who would never take me up on an offer to come to church on a Sunday morning, but I say, hey, yo, I'm featuring at this local open mic. You can come through and just watch. You can sing a song, read a poem, right? And then I can share all of the same faith, inspired poetry that I would in a church, right? But it's also, I think, hypocritical because when I ask, Christian folks, Christian speakers and artists, is like, have you ever gone to mosque? Have you ever gone to a Hindu temple? And you know what I'm saying? It's like we are
Yeah.
expect, hey, have you ever gone to what I'm saying, a Buddhist conference for a whole weekend and given, what I'm saying, and given that type of time and attention to a system that you don't agree with? No, but that's like, and I'm not saying it's wrong to invite people into those spaces, but it just makes a lot more sense to go in the world that already
Mm-hmm.
exists and to
Yeah.
engage as a creative and say, like, to me it's not even like, oh, I'm on this secret it's all one and the same. Like when I write a poem that overtly talks about God versus a poem that's just expressing a beautiful moment of playing with my nephews and nieces, or being heartbroken. Everything that I write is through the lens of a person of faith. So,
Mm-hmm.
if I write a sex song, it's through a lens of a person of faith, right? And it's not no any more or less Christian than the ones that overtly, quote scripture or mention Jesus, right? And some of the conversations I've gotten in, the spiritual conversations that have come after someone has engaged with my art or seen me perform, it's not always from the overtly Christian poems. It's from the poems that just resonated with something in their soul, and then they wanted to come and have a conversation about a deep wound that they had about their father, or about, hey, they grew up in a different faith, but they related to something I said, even though I didn't necessarily mention Jesus. And so, yeah, I just think it's a beautiful way to just go and engage your community, and also experience great art. And it's not just like I'm on this mission there. I'm also receiving a lot of beautiful things that have helped me grow as a person.
Yeah, I remember doing this with you, where you're just like, we've got a night off. Do you want to just look up open night, open mic nights? I
Yeah.
think in New Zealand or something. And we were like, sure. And then we just went to some local pub, and
Yeah.
then you rocked the house, of course, because it didn't feel fair. But anyway, but it was epic. But but yeah, I remember just even the kind of like out of the box, like that's a fun thing to do. Why not?
Yeah.
Why not do it more? Like, why not look for? So if you're looking for ways to just sort of see what this is like, everybody, and move into spaces that might be abnormal for you, but really an invitation to kind of just be with people and listen to their stories. And as you were talking, Mike, I was thinking about just the history of the world in some ways. I've been reading a bunch of different things, and how artists have always been truth tellers in culture that offer this like truth that's deeper truth. So not just like, again, I think we're moving from a season of like our head to our hearts. And it can be really problematic to know how to do that, to just go
Mhm.
from like knowledge, which is on offer everywhere now with Chat GPT. I mean, you could literally just get knowledge wherever you want, but actually there's a knowing that's deeper than what you know with your head. And I feel like
Mhm.
that's artists lead us there. Like that's where they're the ones that have already done this work and can help us. So, are there artists that you are like, I was thinking of Dostoevsky in Russia
Mhm.
under like some of the most extreme, empire uh, limitations on what people can read and what people can know, with the
Mhm.
lack of flow of information. And then Dostoevsky writes novels, and
Mhm.
in the novels are some of the most, amazing, beautiful descriptions of faith and doubt and fear and God. You can't
Yeah.
really stop that. You just can't stop that. That's, he's writing from a gulag, and here he is changing the
Yeah.
hearts of Russians in the midst of the the most oppressive regime, and the same is
Yeah.
true in history all over the place. So are there people we should be looking to? Like, what are ways that we get this and see it, and maybe even start moving towards it? I was thinking the other day, like, why do we even still preach in church? Why isn't church
Mhm.
just more of a poetry session? Do you see this as a day coming,
Oh,
Micah? Like,
mercy.
is this something that you're hoping for?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel more connected to community and to that, what I think the idea of church, being that community, being that sense of family. I've felt that so many times at open mics, and not as often in church settings. And I've been in a lot of church settings. And I think for me, it's not just about being a vocational artist, like this is your job or you're a professional, you make money off of it. No, I absolutely think we should reframe how we think about creativity, culturally speaking. As a person of faith, when I get opportunities to teach creative writing classes, I talk about it. I say creative writing as a spiritual discipline, or creative expression. It doesn't just have to be creative writing. Creative expression as a spiritual discipline, in the sense of, in the same way that we pray, that we study scripture, that we fast, that we do these other things, um, and even beyond that, just a holistic health discipline like exercise, or eating your vegetables type thing. Because as long culturally, what we really think about creativity is kind of this, it's this non-essential entertainment or fun or personal hobby thing, right? And as long as we think about it that way, then we won't value it, and we won't have a relationship with it, that can really benefit us as much as it ought to. So, for example, I'll often like perform or do some sort of workshop, and afterwards people will come up to me and they'll say, man, I used to write poetry, or I used to paint, I used to dance. I used to be in a band back in college, or, whatever the thing is. And I always ask the same question, why'd you stop? And it's pretty much the same answer. Oh, well, I got back, I went back to school. I was working on my doctorate, or I got married, had a couple kids, or life got so busy and so stressful, I just didn't have time for it. And I always say, this is what I'm hearing. You used to do this thing that helped you deal with your stress. And then life got more stressful and you needed it even more. But because you thought about it as this self-indulgent thing, of course you're going to cut it as a non-important, non-essential thing. And I always tell folks, if you would have understood creativity as an important discipline, you wouldn't say, I used to pray, but I got too busy, so I stopped. You say, no matter how busy I get, prayer needs to be. Now, some people do that.
Let's
right?
hope so. Let's hope so,
yeah,
Micah.
yeah, right. But some people do that. But when
Yeah.
you think of it as already something that's not really that necessary, it's so much easier to dismiss it. And I'm like, no, let's reframe it as like, okay, yes, you can live without prayer. You can live without exercising. But if you discipline yourself to exercise, if you discipline yourself to pray, then you will be holistically healthier, mind, body, right? And I said, that's how we should think about creativity, because I guarantee you, instead of just stopping, if you would get home from work and pick up that guitar, even for just 10, 15 minutes and wail on it a little bit, maybe you wouldn't get in as many fights with your spouse, right? Maybe you wouldn't be as stressed out because you're engaging this creative expression that really grounds you. And so it's not the only thing, but I want to reframe it as an important discipline that is akin to other holistic health disciplines. Because yeah, once you understand it like that, then you're less likely to just stop doing it, because you understand this is actually making my life and my relationships better, my relationship to God, my relationship to myself. That's one of the biggest things for me. It's not about, I don't care if I am a professional artist or I was doing this before I was getting paid for it, right? I did it because I didn't really grow up examining myself too much, especially as a stereotypical male, right? I wasn't up here thinking about my feelings, right? It was just, you just suppress, you're not supposed to have emotions besides anger, right? It's like, that's it. And suddenly I started going to open mics and dudes was up there talking about feeling sad or lonely or even positive emotions were seen as bad. Like, you can't be too in love. That will make you soft, right? So it's like,
Wow.
suddenly people were on stage doing poems and songs about just being a human being. And I was like, oh, wow, other people uh, feel that too. And no one's making fun of them. And it's actually okay. And not only are people okay with it, but they're applauding their vulnerability, right? So yeah, I just think culturally, we really need to understand creative expression as an important part of our spiritual and holistic well-being.
I love that
Yeah.
so much. And I would say the other thing that probably you've been combating and pretty well spoken about, which I really love, is it's just the commodification of everything. So like if you can't make money at it, then
Mhm.
you shouldn't do it or something like that, where again, you just mentioned that quickly, but I think that's a big reason why it got it on the chopping block.
Yeah.
Because we just were like, well, like if you said to your parents, I feel like an artist, they'd all be like,
Yeah.
no, not an artist, because
Yeah.
artists, can't make money or whatever. There's no way to climb that ladder and in our, commodification of every single thing that got hacked. And I think that's also really important to pay attention to is, our chief aim in life is not to be rich. It's not to make money. It's not, now everybody's got to eat. I understand. I'm not trying to romanticize poverty, but I do think there's something deeper that God is calling people to in this season. And part of that calling is going to be letting go of these other things that we've been put on, we put on a hierarchy of importance because they pay well or people think highly of them or, whatever, prominence and finances. So I do think
Yeah.
there is this like resurgence, I believe, of like living differently and even just learning how to live differently to make that happen. What if artists were invited to live in different communities for a discounted rent because their art was seen as something beautiful offered to the world, that wasn't commercially viable, but was a beautiful part of, the community itself.
No,
Anyway,
absolutely.
interesting.
Absolutely. I 100%, like everything we do in Western culture, like people measure success by fame and the amount of money you can make off of it.
Mm-hmm.
How many people know you? How many followers do you have? And how
Mm-hmm.
many dollars is this thing generating? And that's just, even apart from being a Christian and the particular spiritual issues I have with that. Even historically, especially when it comes to art, it's never been true that the most talented and influential artists were the most successful. There's example after example of artists who we now retrospectively say, oh, they were before their time. And they
Mm-hmm.
spent their whole life broke
Yep.
because they were doing things that were countercultural, that were pushing the
Mm-hmm.
culture forward. They were not widely accepted ideas, expressions of their creativity. Everyone's like, what are you doing? That's weird, or that's wrong, or I don't like that, or actually, I really relate to that, but I'm not going to admit it because it's not
Or
popular.
or stop saying that, like,
Yes,
or even just like, we're going to kill you if you keep speaking, like, or keep painting, or keep,
absolutely.
stop doing that. And they refused, which is
And they
part of
absolutely
the
refuse.
witness of like freedom and expression and free speech and all kinds of things.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so if they were looking at themselves like, I guess I'm not a real artist, or I guess this is a waste of time because people don't like this. Since when have we said popular equals good, right, just? That's not true. There are a lot of
Mhm.
things that are popular that are not good, that are not right, that are not
Mhm.
just. You are successful in being faithful to yourself, to God, to your creativity, whether or not you have a big following or make a lot of money off of it. And like you said,
Mhm.
yes, you have to exist, right? You have to pay your bills, but it's just false. Even again, not even with artistry, but as someone, who is a preacher or a speaker, what I'm saying? It's like,
Mhm.
are your truths not worth speaking unless you're getting a lot of money off of it? Since
Right.
when has that been the measure of
Yeah,
faithful?
Jesus was under that measure. Jesus was
Yeah,
really, really, really not a good communicator or
exactly.
leader or whatever. Yeah. Um,
Exactly.
Talk to me about detox now. What is it about?
Oh
What are you
yeah,
hoping to
yeah.
communicate? Tell me
So
about where you're at.
Detox,
And yeah.
yeah, Detox was actually my most recent album, but it came out in 2021, and I'm working
Okay.
on a new album now, which I'll definitely tell you about. But Detox was an album where I had been thinking about the the Me Too movement. I've
Mhm.
been thinking about a lot of um, relationship of like gender in culture, the you know this kind of gender war. Out of the Me Too movement, there was this like perception that there was this witch hunt against men in Hollywood trying to get you canceled and all of these things, which is ridiculous to me. But I was just thinking about that a lot, and I wanted to address it, right? A lot of times I just live and create. I'm not on any particular like I'm gonna make an album about this. I'm just kind of writing about what I was going through. But this was one time where I was like, no, I want to address this. And so I started thinking about it, and I was like, making an album to address toxic masculinity, speaking to every man in the world, seemed very broad. And I was like, I don't know. I was like, let me kind of narrow this a little bit. Let me try to focus it. And so then I was like, well, one of the things I noticed, like as a Black person in America, race affects my life a lot. And I realized that there was actually a lot of significant difference between Black masculinity and the reasons and the ways our masculinity expresses itself is very different from white masculinity. And so that was one thing I noticed. But then I started thinking, like, well, it's not just race or ethnicity, it's also like generations. Like, my dad's era is different from my. So then I was like, okay, I want to talk to black men. Oh, well, I want to talk to younger black men. And I was like, well, even regional, like black men from California versus black men from like Texas. And it just kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So eventually what happened was on Detox specifically, I was like, I want to talk to teenage Micah because that was the age where I really started to develop a lot of thoughts around gender and women and all of these things. And I thought, whatever I say on this album, I want to explain it in a way that would make sense to 15, 16-year-old Micah at Long Beach Polytechnic High School, right? Now, not to say I agree with that guy on everything, because I don't, but I want to talk about whatever I'm talking about in a way that makes sense to this younger version of me. That's what Detox was. And that was both in the sound and the music that I liked at the time, and then also in the messaging and how I had those conversations. And it was very eye-opening and confrontational, in a good way. But yeah, so Detox was inspired by that, by instead of just like, let me set all these guys wrong, it's like, or right, who have bad thinking about women. It's like, no, let me confront the ways I was taught. And even if I've corrected on certain things, it was a process. And so I didn't want to put out this self-righteous thing like, I'm a good guy, all you bad guys. It's like, nah, like I get where this comes from, and we're all on a journey and we're all healing. And that being said, like there was the cultural aspect of just like where I was from and ethnicity and stuff, but there was also the religious aspect. A lot of my thinking around gender and women in church and preaching and leadership has changed. And it's sometimes awkward, right? Because you're like, it's hard to admit when you were doing something that you now think is harmful, but you never did it from a place of hatred. And I was having a conversation with a friend one time, and she was struggling to forgive herself for things she used to believe. And I don't really struggle that way. And the reason I don't struggle that way is because I know on certain things, it was never coming from hate. It was coming from me trying to be faithful. And I was born into a particular community that said, this is the right way, specifically when it comes to like faith communities that have been oppressive to any particular people group. I was like, I didn't just grow up in conservative church. Then I went to an even more conservative Bible college. And every single one of my professors, who literally these guys helped translate the ESV, they speak Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and even the women professors were all like, women can't be pastors. Women shouldn't preach. It had nothing to do with 18-year-old Micah Bournes hating women. It was, I'm trying to be faithful to Jesus. And these are folks who know a lot more than me. And they're telling me that this is what the Bible says. And then they show me where, and I'm like, I mean, I guess that makes sense. I'm just trying to be faithful to God, right?
Yeah.
Now, I have grown and found other interpretations and other people who are just as committed but think differently. But I didn't have that at the time. I went from my conservative church to my even more conservative Bible college. And I was like, well, if this is the truth, like, I don't know why, but I'm just trying to be faithful. And so that's what I was telling my friend. It's not that I don't admit that it was wrong, but I don't feel ashamed for that version of me doing what he thought was right at the time. That's all I can ever ask of myself. The people around me were teaching me things that I no longer agree with, but at the time, they were my spiritual authority, and I wanted to be obedient. And so I'm like, I wasn't being rebellious. I was trying to be faithful. I was trying to do what is good and right and true, And so I'm
I
like,
guess that's when I think that's good. Like, I think everyone, you do what you know until you know better, and then you do
exactly.
different, right? That's
Yeah.
but I guess it's if you refuse to know better,
Yes.
if you refuse to know more, then you're entering into sort of some sense of complicity or
Yeah.
with this limited version of truth. So that's interesting that curiosity, is sort of the superpower that leads us into a lack of judgment and an openness to keep learning and to keep
Totally.
understanding in a way that's honoring to not only God, but to each other. I love
Yeah.
that. I love that idea too of just speaking to your own self. I remember when you shared, it was at a Brave global fundraiser at the very beginning. You came and did a
Mhm.
spoken word in Long Beach, and you gave that spoken word that you do on watching the chicken commercial. Isn't it a chicken commercial? What was
Oh
it? It was
yeah,
what
it was
Carl's
Carl's Jr. Carl's Jr. But it
Ah,
was a
College
burger.
Junior.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, it was a burger, and
yeah, yeah.
it's this spoken word where you talk about that's when that's when you learned, or it was taught to you, that women were for sale.
Yes, yes,
And that was so, and you were like, I think you were like 10 or so when you were like,
yeah,
I'm looking at this commercial selling me chicken and selling me chicken with a woman,
yeah,
and realizing like women are a commodity. And it was very powerful in terms of thinking through how this happens, like even
yeah.
just on a general idea of, well, it happened, like it's okay that this happens because we've all been groomed to believe
Mhm.
that women are for sale. That was really powerful.
Yeah, like you're
um
not a terrible person when a billion
right,
dollar industry is pouring in so many resources to
right,
brainwash you in a particular way of thinking.
yes,
You know,
that's right,
whether that is the fast food industry or the institutional religion you were raised in, it's
right,
like you don't need to be ashamed for that. That was thrown at you. And then you, like you said, when you know better, you do better, you
yeah.
know? Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for doing that. What's your new project? Tell me about that and how people can get involved.
Yeah, so I am currently working on an album reflecting on romance. And I'm about to be 36 years old. I've never been married. And I definitely thought I would have been by now.
Well, I
And
tried to set you up, Micah. I tried.
many have tried. Many have failed, including myself. I'll be trying. But yeah, it's interesting because
And
you know,
yet you're living this beautiful, full, rich
absolutely love my
life.
life.
Right.
Yes. And it's interesting because I never really set out to write about justice issues. When I started writing, I was just writing about my life. But I happen to be Black in America, so a lot of my experiences reflected issues of justice. Um, and so it was like more people in that world who heard my work and they started using that language to describe my art. And I was like, oh,
Mm.
interesting, I guess, right? But I've also always been a romantic. I love love. But a lot of the events that I would get invited to, I've been writing love songs and love poems, but it just didn't make any sense to perform them at these justice faith conferences, right? But the more I started thinking about it, especially after detox, um, so many societal ills start in the context of romantic relationships and family. You know, if you want to talk about domestic abuse, if you want to talk, I mean, you could go, list goes on and on and on.
Hmm.
So many things on a grand scale happen on a little micro scale within romantic relationships. And so I started realizing as I am thinking through my own experiences and expectations for romantic love, this does actually speak to bigger issues than me. And so that's pretty much what the albums are about. It was supposed to be one album, but it's two because I wrote too many songs. Because I started on it
Because
like
it's
during the
love, man.
pandemic.
How are you
Yeah,
going to limit
exactly.
love to 10 songs? Good luck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the inexhaustible subject. But also, I started working on this like during the pandemic. So I couldn't do live shows, which is what I spent a lot of my time doing. I'm stuck in the house. And for basically 2 years, 2020 to 2022, I was just I had gone through two separate, like right after another, kind of disappointing romantic situations that I was hopeful for and it ended up not working out. But I was also doing a lot of research on love. I was reading a lot of books by Bell Hooks, who wrote like 4 or 5 books on the topic. Um,
Mm-hmm. I was
and
just going to
so,
say Bell Hooks has been my like number one teacher
oh,
on
absolutely.
love as a construct, but also like as a deep, like the deepest transformational place to understand, to live different. Like it's, yeah, it's amazing. And her
Absolutely.
work, one of her, if the audience hasn't read any Bell Hooks, you need to go read Bell Hooks on love.
Yes.
And one of the things I think she stuck to, which is just amazing when you think even still we struggle with this, but she was talking about the lack of love for men
Yes.
and how the lack of love for men has led to so many of these social ills,
Yeah.
and the lack of men to find love, to express love, to know love, to be loved. Just
Yes.
this is the fundamental problem with men. Like, and she's writing as a Black feminist
Yes.
theologian. And
Yes.
and she got a lot of heat for that from the beginning. And still, I think some people are like, that's not the right approach. But I thought it was just mind blowing to me,
Oh,
and
absolutely,
still is.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely, because it's writing from, it's not denying the fact that men in general have been in a position of power and oppression, but it's acknowledging that even privileged communities suffer under certain oppressions. White people
yeah, and
also
a lack of
suffer.
love. And a
Yes,
lack of love. And that
yes,
ultimately, no matter how much privilege you have, if it doesn't have love, if you don't have love, then it's worth nothing. You actually end up like, at what cost is this
yes,
privilege coming without love? And you can kind of, I mean, it's very, I mean, you just read the gospels and
yeah,
Jesus will help us. Again, you're just like, actually, she's just kind of echoing a gospel truth that there's something more valuable than money, something more valuable than privilege, something more valuable than power, and it's love.
no,
So
absolutely.
yeah,
And I
that's
love Bell Hooks
great.
because she talks about love not just in romance. She wrote a
Right.
book called All About Love, which is like her most famous one, which is a general overview. But
Yeah.
then she gets more specific, and she's talking about family love, friendship, even love in the workplace, how to create a
Mhm.
loving workplace environment. Um, like, so there's All About Love, but then there's books that she wrote specifically to women, specifically to men, specifically to Black people, and I read all of them.
Nice.
And yeah, during the pandemic, so she's very influential on my thought. But I think one of the biggest takeaways I got from her was that the principles of love are consistent, and that sometimes in romantic relationships, uh, we tolerate things that we wouldn't in other expressions of love because we put it on a pedestal like romantic love is the most important thing. And she goes, no, 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 no. At first, we do it growing up, it's first with family, right? It's like family first. And then when you get older, if you have a romantic partner, it's like your romantic partner first, then your family, then your friends. And she goes, no, that's not how it works. Love is consistent. And just because they are your family, that type of love is not necessarily more or less important than friendship, right? And she goes, for a lot of people, for example, their friends are the very first place that they feel completely welcomed and free to be themselves. But basically, what she says in the context of romance is by putting romance on a pedestal, we actually cheapen it and we allow ourselves to be abused. Because she gives the example of, she's like, I know women who, as their friend, if I ever spoke to them in a really harsh, belittling way, that would happen once, and they would have a conversation with me. If you love me and you're my friend, you're not allowed to speak to me like that, or you're
Mhm.
not going to be in my life anymore. Once
Mhm.
or twice, that's it. And we don't ever talk to each other like that. And yet, those same women will stay in romantic relationships where they are constantly belittled, constantly torn
Mhm.
down verbally in other ways, but they endure it because, like, well, we have to keep this relationship because it's so important. And what's actually, if you had the same boundaries across all expressions of love, all of your relationships would be healthier. Same thing with family. I
Mhm.
don't care that we share blood. You're not allowed to treat me poorly just because we family.
Mhm.
Like, you're not stuck with me as an adult, especially, right? Like, and again, same thing. I'm reading this and it feels shocking because I was like, family first, family first. But it's like, no, for the reality, a lot of people's families were abusive. They were super unhealthy. They had to escape their family environment. They need strong environments, not because they're hating their family, but because it was literally destroying their souls, right?
Mhm.
And so, and again, relating back to Jesus is like, man, Jesus was like, who is my mama? It's like whoever does the will of God, that's my
Mhm.
family, right? Like, and
Yeah.
so it was just a very challenging concept, and be like, oh yeah, sometimes because we love someone so much, um, we think we're doing them a favor, but we might be enabling them to continue to not just treat us, but other people poorly and thinking that that is okay or that's a healthy way to exist, and it's not.
Yeah, or and in the end, you have this great so-called romance or romantic love that's void of
Mhm.
actual love.
Exactly, exactly.
Just like, what are
Yeah,
we doing? Like, and again, it's the illusion of love. So it's this, I also think we have this addiction as a society to hierarchy. So we have
yeah.
to do this like hierarchical list of everything. And you're like, why are we living like this? Like also seasons change and I change and you change and we have different, like it's just like, wow, we're just addicted to this. Like, in what order should I do? And you're like, but if love was the ordering, which I think is the point. Like, if you were orientated by love,
Mhm.
then the hierarchy would no longer need to exist.
Exactly.
And you could call every relationship to be a loving and back to love and to be a loving relationship. And that way you're being someone who's loving, but also you're helping other people live into their best loving selves, which is beautiful. That's a
Yeah.
lot to do in 2 albums, Micah. When's it
It
out?
is. It
When's it
is.
out?
So I'm currently doing a fundraiser to
Okay.
help me complete it because I
Right.
was writing all these songs, but I also wasn't able to perform because everything was shut down. And honestly, I lost a lot of momentum as an independent artist. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I had just each gig had led to the next over a decade. And then for two
Mm-hmm.
years, I didn't do any shows. And
Mm-hmm.
so I had a lot of time to write, but I wasn't bringing in a lot of income. So I am doing a GoFundMe campaign. And it's just gofundme.com/Micah Bournes. And I am trying to raise money to help complete these albums. My hope is that I'm able to put them out sometime next year, 2025. So I'm trying to raise money the rest of the year and hit the studio. But yeah, so it's gonna be out when I can pay for it. But I'm really excited about the songs. They are a good mix of like my personal experiences with love as well as my observations of the world and then also my like wrestling with some of these new thoughts. Um, but last thing I want to say about that though, like when it comes to conceptually, as a person of faith, I think a lot of Christian people stay in abusive relationships because of bad theology, in my opinion. I heard this woman speak one time, and she's a Christian, and she was like, my therapist sees all kind of clients, and she goes, so many of my clients who are Christian women, they on a super higher like percentage tend to stay in abusive marriages. And part of the reason they do that is because they think divorce is a sin, right? And so their husbands will literally be beating them or, being manipulative or verbally abusive. And they're like, well, I don't want to dishonor God by getting a divorce. And I don't, I'm pretty confident God doesn't want you to stay in an abusive marriage, right?
Well, Micah,
Um,
Micah, I would say not only do they think this because it's kind
yeah,
of been embedded into
yeah,
them, but they're told this still.
yes,
Like
yes.
there are
And
so many women I know who went for help to church or to a
mhm,
Christian counselor, and the church or the pastor or the Christian counselor said, "Hey, maybe if you just loved him more."
yes,
And again, this is such a
yeah,
distortion of what love is and what love
exactly.
requires. I'm so glad you're saying this. It's really,
Yes,
really
and
key.
and they quote
Mhm.
scripture, right? And then it's
Yep.
like, oh, love is patient and endures all things and all of this, right? And I think that is a complete misapplication of that scripture because when we talk about love enduring and being long suffering, right? Love is long suffering. I agree. However, there's context to this. And I think like in the traditional marriage vows, through sickness and health and poverty and wealth, if you're in a romantic relationship, a marriage, whatever, like yes, there are things in life that will oppress, right? There are oppressive institutions, there are famines, there's, what I'm saying, droughts, and like you and your partner will endure sickness and all kind of wars in the world. But it's not saying that your actual partner being the source of that, it's not love endures all things if you have an abusive partner. It's like, no, we as a unit can endure whatever life brings us. It's not saying that I'm going to stay no matter how you treat me, like no matter how abusive you are towards me. If I love you, I will stay. No, if you love the person, love is about liberation. Like my mentor in college, he helped me reframe that, because often we think about love as possession, right? If I love this person, I have to keep them, right? I have to stay in relationship with them. I have to own them in some sense. And he goes, that is not at all gospel love. Love is about liberation. So instead of saying, what do I have to do to keep and to own and possess? The question should be, in both directions, how can I operate in a way that makes you feel the most free, that makes you feel like the most liberated version of yourself, right? And so it's never about keeping and owning and possessing and controlling. But in that, if you both are committed to the liberation of the other and to combating anything, both within yourself and within this world, that might compromise that freedom, then it gives you a much higher chance of staying together. Because if you are with a partner who is totally committed to your thriving and your liberation, and as you are to theirs, why would you want to leave? You know what I'm saying? Why would you want to leave? And so it really helped me reframe. It's like, instead of how do I keep you, it's, yeah, how can I continue this commitment to seeing you free? You know?
Hey guys, thanks for listening. And thanks for being open to discover and be curious and to learn from voices that maybe you don't normally hear, and topics that you really didn't sign up for in the season. But I think this crazy wild ride of discovery is a way of learning and growing and becoming even better humans together, whether we agree or not. So thanks for being on the ride. As a thank you, I wanted to offer you a code that you can enter at the Deep and Wide Academy. So that's at deepwideacademy.com, deepwideacademy.com. The code is right side up. That's the name of this podcast. So just right side up at the deepwideacademy.com, and it will get you 20% off on all of or any of the courses offered there. Those courses are intended to be deep and wide, experiential wisdom shared in order to pass it on, not just knowledge, but wisdom, which is applied knowledge and practiced knowledge and embodied knowledge. So if this is something that might interest you, which I hope it is, and you either want to check it out and learn, or you want to be a collaborator, and you can contact us in that regard. But anyway, check it out. Code right side up. It'll get you 20% off. And deepwideacademy.com is available for you. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of this episode. It's beautiful. I also think to allow somebody to abuse, even if it's you or anyone else for that matter, is to do harm to them.
Absolutely.
So when you're in an abusive relationship, not only do you need to honor yourself in that situation and say, this is unsafe, and then as a result of it being unsafe, it's ungodly. Like, this isn't what God wants for me. I've got to remove myself to be safe. That's like just number one, do that. But number two is, this is terrible for this person that is in this cycle of abuse. And in order to love them fully, I need to actually remove myself and create some space so that they can maybe figure out what they're doing and get some help for it. So it's also like, I think that cycle traps everybody. Oppression is cyclical, in that the person who's oppressing is as oppressed, whether they realize it or not, as the person who is being oppressed, and both need liberation. Absolutely. And that's that, so that's why that consistent message of like, women need to stay in abusive relationships, or anybody needs to stay in an abusive relationship, is out of love, is such a distortion of what love is. 100%. Agree with you wholeheartedly. I love that, liberating love. And of course you see this in Jesus the most, who constantly is just giving away healing, and then like, be on your way, don't tell anybody, it's not about me, it's about your healing, it's about your
Yeah.
freedom all the time, choosing, I think even giving people choices all the time. Do you want to come? Do you want to stay? Do you want to be healed? Do you want to follow
Yeah.
me? Do you still want to follow me?
Exactly.
Um,
Like you don't have to be here,
no, and
you know?
you can't get a leader who's more clear on the freedom piece
Yes.
than Jesus, right?
Yeah, it's like, yo,
Yeah.
y'all want to leave too? He like literally after so many people, they're like, oh, eat my flesh and drink my blood. That sounds weird. I don't know about that. It was like, yo, y'all could go if you want,
Yeah, and
like
then even the
yeah,
last words of
yeah,
Jesus to his disciples are like, I don't consider you servants. This is like
yeah,
the most high God.
yes,
I don't consider you servants. I consider you friends.
yes,
And that idea of friendship being a relationship that's reciprocal, and you can choose that. You
yeah,
choose that on a daily basis. You're free then to be friends with God. And I mean, cheapers, that's powerful. Like,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
how Jesus could do that for his disciples, but we can't figure that out in marriage. Like, I
Yeah,
can't just say yes to my husband in marriage every day because I want his life to be better and he wants my life to be better, and we figure that out together. Like, I can't do that. That's too hard for me. We have to have a hierarchical system, and I'm a servant of his like oppressive power so that he
yeah,
feels better about himself. But Jesus can tell the disciples, like, I consider you
right.
friends. Like, it's just like,
Yes.
wow, we just didn't get it.
And
Somebody missed a memo. Someone missed a memo. And the memo is about, like, I don't know, 4 gospels long, everybody.
right? But and I love that you're saying that because for me, understanding theology as a poet, once I became an artist and seeing so many metaphors in scripture, it really tears down these like rigid roles that you were describing, right? This is the leader, this is subservient, and it's stuck in that way. But
Mm-hmm.
that's not even true about how God describes the relationships to human beings. And
Right.
so for me, once I started thinking about it metaphorically, I was like, oh, this makes sense because there's three main metaphors and maybe more, but three main metaphors in scripture that describe God's relationship to humanity. One of them is a parent and child, right? God the Father. But then another one is a romantic partner. Jesus is the groom and the church is the bride. And then another of them is friends. We are co-heirs with Christ. We are brothers. We are, siblings with divinity, right? We are friends with divinity. And so for me, I'm like, oh, this was never about like God is father and we are children, period. But it's like, it's never about I mean, am I gonna go to heaven and have sex with Jesus? Am I his bride? No, these are metaphors. They're metaphors. And to me, the whole point is God is saying every single way that you as a human understand love, that's how I love you. As a parent to a child, as romantic partners, and as friends to friends. The whole point is my love is not rigid, it's flexible. And in a partnership, in any given moment, we might need to show up for each other in different ways, right? There sometimes, like even as romantic partners, you got to let them crawl into your lap like a crying child and comfort them. And there's other times where you light the candle and you get sexy. And there's other times, it's like it's not like this is what I do, this is what you do, and it can't change. It's like how in what particular time and moment in life do we need to show up for each other?
I love,
And we
I
can
also
do that.
love, I also love that because there is actually no partner that can be all those things.
Yes.
And that again, it's that idolization of one partnership over all the other loving relationships in our life. So I have many loving relationships. I have a
Yes.
husband that I get some intimacy from, and we share our lives together in beautiful ways. But I also have great friendships with other people that offer
Yes.
some of those things. And I have mentors and older friends in my life that give me some parental guidance, and my own family, and on this goes. But that idea of like right sizing relationships too, I think that's one of the great problems with a romanticized love, especially in these days where everything's so, like, I was my friends on, an app, a dating app, and she's just telling me about like how horrible it is in the dating world. And she's on this dating app. And I remember saying, like, I would never marry my husband if I met him on an app. Like we're literally non-compatible on paper. Like
Yeah,
we
yeah,
don't work. Like, and
yeah,
actually sometimes if one of us, if you know us from a distance or whatever, you'd be like, how do you guys work? You know? And I'm like, we don't work on paper. It doesn't work. It's a miracle of love. It really is. It's
yes,
love. And it's this liberating love. It's that I want him to be his best self. So how do I
yeah,
help that happen? And he wants me to be mine. So how does he help? And we figure it out. And that's what love is. So I think that idea of like, there's some perfect person who can be these things to you. You know, that's an illusion. There is no one, there's only one person who can be those things to you. And I think it's Jesus, you know, it's like a
yeah,
divine love. But even in that, I need other people. Like it's not
yes,
meant to be just me by myself understanding God. It's meant to be me in community experiencing God. So it's
yeah.
fascinating how messed up we are in this very essential thing.
Exactly, exactly. And absolutely, like, right, only God can be all of those things. But
Right.
I think we take metaphorical language and we try to make it like
Yeah.
objective, dry theology. And you're
Yeah.
like, no, like you can't. I mean, these metaphors, they get weird if you try to like force them to be so rigid, right? Because like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, you have the metaphor of the bride of Christ, but like you said, even that, well, the bride of Christ, the church is a lot of people put together. So it's not just like
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is my boyfriend, I don't need anybody else. It's like, no, okay, like you might be the bride of Christ, but you're also, as the bride, part of a community. And
Right.
that community is in relationship with God. It's collective worship, right? So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like
It's
there's
cool.
like, yeah, nobody. Okay, it's like, let's look at it as a poet. And then you're like, oh, okay, there's flexibility here, there's creativity here. And I love that. Yeah, like your partner, I think anyone's partner should be flexible, but no one can be everything to you.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. You still need friends. I don't care how good of of a healthy romantic relationship you have. You need friends, you need other relationships in your life. And but again, it goes to the idolization of love. It's like I have my romantic partner, nothing else matters. I'm cutting out my family, friends, whatever. And you're like, that ain't going well, you know?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
that happy ever after thing, isn't it? And
yeah,
but that nobody ever tells you about the after. It's just like
yeah,
assumed that everything's perfect and it's
yeah.
not. Okay, I love that you're doing this. Where do people go again? GoFundMe.
Oh yeah. So yeah, gofundme.com/Micah Bournes. There's also other ways you
Okay.
can support, mainly by engaging my art. So I have a book called Here Comes This Dreamer. I have an anthology called Fight Evil with Poetry that I help put out. I have a lot of different albums in a lot of different genres on Spotify. I have hip hop albums, blues albums, poetry albums set to music. And then in addition to the GoFundMe, which is specifically to fund these albums, I do have a Patreon, and that's something that you can sign up to give monthly. And most people just give smaller amounts, 5, 10, 15, $20 a month. And that's a way to like continue to empower me to make art. But also with Patreon, I give early edition unreleased songs and poems. So I have like a whole manuscript that was on there. I have songs from this album that are like in the demo state that you can listen to if you sign up for Patreon. But yeah, Patreon and my GoFundMe are the two best ways to support. And then when it comes to social media, my Instagram, I'm most active on Instagram, and I just recently made a TikTok as well. But yeah,
Sweet.
yeah,
Good. I look forward to that. So Micah Bournes, everybody, Bournes,
yep.
micahbourne.com. You can find all that stuff there. And also, if you have not listened to Micah before or heard of him, then please check him out. He's an incredible creative voice for good in the world. And I'm super privileged to know him and have learned so much myself and highly recommend his work to you.
Word.
Bless you, Micah. Keep
Oh,
creating.
thanks for having
We
me.
love it.